The air in the Henderson implement dealership hung thick and heavy with the smell of new paint, rubber, and the faint, sharp tang of diesel. It was the smell of progress, the smell of money. It was 1972, and in farm country, progress was measured in horsepower and the width of your disc. Silas Blackwood stood patiently at the parts counter, a ghost in grease-stained overalls. The parts man, a young kid named Jimmy with aspirations of being a salesman, was busy on the phone, laughing about something he'd seen on television the night before. Silas didn't mind the wait. He was a man accustomed to it. He'd waited for rain, waited for sun, waited for the corn to dry down in the field. Waiting on a teenager to order him a head gasket for a 25-year-old Farmall M was just a Tuesday. He ran a calloused thumb over the worn spot on the Formica countertop, where hundreds of farmers before him had leaned, worrying over a broken part in the heat of planting or the panic of harvest. The bell over the front door jingled, and a gust of spring air swirled in, carrying with it Dale Jensen. Dale didn't walk. He strode, filling the room with an energy that demanded attention. He wore crisp, new blue jeans, polished work boots that had never seen a mud-caked feedlot, and a seed corn cap perched just so on his head. He clapped old Mr. Henderson, the owner, on the shoulder with a crack that made the older man wince. "Henderson, you old horse thief," Dale boomed, his voice echoing off the high tin ceiling. "You got the papers ready for me? I've got acres to turn and money to burn." Mr. Henderson, who had been invisible in his office just moments before, materialized with a broad, sycophantic grin. "Dale, good to see you, my boy. Right here, all ready to go. Jimmy," he barked toward the parts counter, "get Mr. Jensen a cup of coffee on the double." Jimmy dropped the phone receiver into its cradle with a clatter and practically tripped over himself getting to the coffee pot. Silas remained at the counter, unmoving, his request for the Farmall gasket seemingly forgotten. He watched the scene unfold with a quiet, impassive gaze. Dale was signing the papers for a brand-new J.I. Case 1370 Agri King. It sat on the showroom floor like a pagan god, an enormous beast of orange and white, its dual rear tires taller than a grown man. It had a closed cab with air conditioning, a radio, and more levers and gauges than the cockpit of a small airplane. It was the biggest, most powerful two-wheel drive tractor the company had ever made, and it was the talk of the entire county. "She's a beauty, Dale, a real beauty," Henderson cooed, wiping a non-existent smudge from the fender with his sleeve. 156 horsepower at the PTO. You'll be able to pull that 24-foot disc like it's a garden rake. "That's the idea," Dale said, not looking up from the loan documents. "Time is money, Henderson. You can't be messing around with old iron if you want to get ahead in this game. Got to spend money to make money." As he said it, his eyes flicked over to the parts counter, landing on Silas for the first time. A slow, condescending smirk spread across his face. "Morning, Silas," he said, his tone dripping with false friendliness. "Keeping that museum collection of yours running?" Silas met his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Morning, Dale. They do the work." "Sure they do," Dale chuckled, turning back to Henderson. "But for how long? A man's got to look to the future. Leverage, Henderson. That's the name of the game today. Land's going up, corn's going up. The bank's practically begging me to take their money. A fella'd be a fool not to take it and expand." He signed the last page with a flourish and pushed the papers across the desk. The deal was done. Another $100,000 of debt, taken on as easily as ordering a cup of coffee. To Dale, it wasn't debt. It was an investment, a tool, no different than the tractor itself. Jimmy finally remembered Silas. "Sorry about that," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "What was it you needed?" "Head gasket, 1949 Farmall M," Silas said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to Dale's booming pronouncements. Jimmy fumbled through the thick, dog-eared parts catalogue, his brow furrowed in concentration. Yeah, looks like we got one in the back." He disappeared into the dusty maze of shelves. Dale sauntered over, leaning an elbow on the counter next to Silas. He smelled of expensive aftershave. "An M, huh? My grandpa had one of those. Good little tractor. For its day. You know, Silas, for what you spend in parts and downtime on that old junk, you could make the payments on a good used 706 or something." something with a little more backbone. "This one's paid for," Silas said simply. He pulled a worn leather wallet from the bib of his overalls. The leather was cracked and soft as cloth from years of use. "Been paid for since before I was born." "Yeah, well, you can't farm 500 acres with a paid-for sentiment," Dale shot back, his smirk returning. "But you do you." He clapped Silas on the shoulder, a gesture that was more of a shove than a friendly pat, and walked out the door to admire his new orange monster. Jimmy returned with the gasket, sealed in a dusty plastic bag. "That'll be $4.72. Silas carefully counted out 5 wrinkled $1 bills and laid them on the counter. He took the change, tucked it and the gasket into his pocket, and gave the kid a nod. "Appreciate it." He walked out of the dealership, past the gleaming Agri King, and didn't give it a second glance. His truck, a 10-year-old Chevy C10, was parked at the far end of the lot. Its blue paint was faded to a chalky patina, and a film of honest field dust covered it from bumper to bumper. He fired it up, the small block 350 V8 rumbling to life with a familiar, comforting rhythm. Driving home, he passed the sprawling acres that Dale Jensen was now farming, land that Dale had bought on credit, land he was working with machinery bought on credit. It looked impressive, there was no denying it. The sheer scale of the operation was something to behold. Silas's own farm was a different story. The lane leading to his house was flanked by tidy fences his father had set 40 years ago. The barn, though in need of a coat of paint, was structurally sound, its foundation straight and true. His equipment was parked in a neat line inside the machine shed. The workhorse was a 1968 John Deere 4020. Its green paint faded on the hood from the relentless Iowa sun, the seat cushion patched with black tape. Beside it sat the old Farmall M, still a capable tractor for lighter work. In the corner was a John Deere 55 combine, a pull-type model that seemed ancient next to the self-propelled giants Dale and the other progressive farmers were buying. But everything was his. The land, 240 acres of it, was free and clear. The house his grandfather built was his. The tractors, the plow, the planter, all of it. Not a single dime was owed to any bank or any man. His father had drilled it into him since he was a boy. Debt is a yoke, son. You put it on your own neck, and you give another man the reins. Silas had never forgotten it. He knew what the others said about him at the diner and the co-op. They said he was old-fashioned, stubborn, afraid. They said he lacked vision. Dale Jensen was the future of farming, and Silas Blackwood was a relic, a stubborn holdout from a bygone era, content to be a small-timer while the world moved on. He heard the whispers. He saw the looks. He didn't care. He had his own vision, and it had nothing to do with the size of his tractor or the number of acres he owed the bank for. It had to do with the quiet satisfaction of turning a key in a machine he owned outright, of tilling soil that belonged to him and his family, not to a lending institution in Des Moines. It was a lonely way to farm, but it was his way. Before we go any further, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like Silas? The kind of quiet, capable man who gets underestimated because his worth isn't measured by shiny new things, but by the strength of his character and the skill in his hands. Let me know in the comments below, because I bet a lot of you have a father, a grandfather, or an uncle just like him. The spring of 1973 came in wet and cold. The ground was saturated, and every day that passed without the corn in the ground was a day of potential yield lost. When a 3-day window of dry weather finally opened up, the county exploded in a frenzy of activity. Diesel smoke hung in the air from dawn till long after dusk. From his fields, Silas could hear the distant, high-pitched whine of Dale Jensen's new Case 1370 running day and night, pulling a brand-new 12-row planter. Silas was out there too, with his 4020 and his old 6-row John Deere planter, making steady progress. He was on his last 40-acre field when it happened. He pushed in the clutch pedal to shift down for a turn on the headland, and it felt wrong. Spongy. He pumped it a few times, but there was no resistance. The pedal went straight to the floorboard with a useless, sickening ease. The tractor was stuck in gear, pulling the planter forward. He throttled down, killed the engine, and coasted to a stop just shy of the fence line. He sat there for a long moment in the sudden silence, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine and the chirping of birds. He knew exactly what it was. The clutch was gone. It was one of the worst breakdowns a man could have, especially during planting. It wasn't a simple fix, not like changing a fuel filter or a hydraulic hose. To replace the clutch on a 4020, you had to split the tractor in two. He walked the 2 miles back to the house, the frustration a bitter taste in his mouth. The next morning, he began the arduous task. He didn't have a modern, heated shop with a concrete floor. He had the machine shed, with its packed dirt floor and a collection of tools his father and grandfather had accumulated over a lifetime. He backed the crippled 4020 into the shed and began the disassembly. First, the side panels and the fuel tank. Then the hydraulic lines had to be disconnected and capped, each one meticulously labeled with a piece of masking tape. The wiring harness, the steering linkage, the throttle control, everything that bridged the gap between the engine and the transmission had to be unhooked. He built 2 heavy-duty wooden stands, cribbing them with oak blocks for stability. Using a 2-ton floor jack, he carefully placed one under the bell housing and the other under the front of the transmission case. The most critical part was ensuring everything was perfectly level and stable. A tractor falling off the stands could kill a man, and Silas was working alone. He unbolted the massive bolts that held the 2 halves of the tractor's frame together. The final bolt came out with a groan of stressed metal. Using a long pry bar, he gently, painstakingly, began to separate the 2 halves. The front end, holding the massive 6-cylinder diesel engine, rolled forward on its wheels, while the back half, with the transmission and final drives, stayed put on its stand. 1 inch, then 2. Soon there was a 6-inch gap. He could see the problem. The pressure plate was a mess of broken springs and scored metal. The clutch disc itself was worn down to the rivets. He spent the rest of the day cleaning 50 years of accumulated grease and dirt from the bell housing. His hands and arms black to the elbows. The next day he drove his Chevy into town to get the parts. He laid the burnt-out pressure plate and shattered disc on the counter. The new kit cost him nearly $200, a significant expense, but he paid for it in cash from a coffee can he kept hidden in the workshop. As he was leaving, Dale Jensen's shiny new pickup truck pulled in. Dale hopped out, looking rested and clean. "Breakdown, Silas?" he asked, a knowing grin on his face. He'd seen the half-finished field from the road. "Clutch," Silas replied, loading the heavy parts box into the bed of his truck. Dale whistled. "Ouch, right in the middle of planting. That's tough luck. You know Henderson's got a brand new 4430 on the lot. Power shift, sound guard cab. You'd never have to touch a clutch pedal again. He'd give you a good trade on that old 4020, even as a parts machine." "I'll get her fixed," Silas said, slamming the tailgate shut. "Suit yourself," Dale shrugged, turning to go into the dealership. "While you're playing mechanic, I'll be finishing my last field. Like I said, time is money." The words stung, but Silas didn't let it show. He drove home, the weight of the lost time pressing down on him. Reassembly was even harder than taking it apart. Lining up the transmission input shaft with the splines of the new clutch disc was a game of millimeters. He had to roll the heavy front half of the tractor back and forth, using shims on the dirt floor, nudging it with a pry bar, getting on and off the tractor to rock the rear wheel and turn the transmission shaft just a fraction of an inch. It was sweaty, frustrating, back-breaking work. For 2 days he wrestled with it. His knuckles were raw, his back screamed in protest, and at one point he threw a wrench across the shed in a rare show of anger. Finally, on the 3rd afternoon, with a final gentle push, he felt it. The satisfying clunk as the splines engaged. The 2 halves of the tractor were mated once more. He worked feverishly, rebolting the frame, reconnecting the lines, the linkages, the wires. He filled the hydraulic system, bled the fuel lines, and reinstalled the fuel tank. Covered in grease, exhausted to the bone, he climbed onto the seat. He turned the key. The starter ground, and the big diesel engine coughed to life, settling into its familiar, powerful rhythm. He pushed the new clutch pedal. It was smooth, firm, perfect. He slipped it into gear, and the tractor moved. A wave of profound relief and pride washed over him. He had done it. He had faced a catastrophic failure, and with his own 2 hands, he had conquered it. He finished planting that last field as the sun set, the rows a little less perfect than he would have liked, but they were done. The corn was in the ground. As he drove back to the house, he passed the local diner. The parking lot was full of pickup trucks. Through the big plate glass window, he could see a group of farmers gathered around a table, Dale Jensen in the middle, holding court, laughing. Silas knew they were probably talking about him, about his old tractor breaking down, about the fool who tried to save a nickel and cost himself $1. He just kept on driving. He was tired, but he was debt-free, and his tractor was running better than ever. The years that followed were a blur of prosperity that seemed like it would never end. The mid-1970s were the golden years for the American farmer. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly bought nearly a quarter of the United States wheat crop, an event that became known as the Great Grain Robbery. Prices for corn, soybeans, and wheat shot to the moon and stayed there. Suddenly, farming wasn't just a way of life, it was a gold rush. The change was most visible in men like Dale Jensen. The boom didn't just make him successful, it made him a prophet. His philosophy of farm big or get out became the gospel of the coffee shop. The banks, flush with cash from oil-rich nations, were eager to lend, and Dale was their star customer. Interest rates were high, but with corn at $3 a bushel, it didn't seem to matter. The numbers always worked on paper. In 1975, Dale bought the old Miller farm, another 320 acres of prime bottomland that bordered his own. To work it, he traded in the Case 1370, which was only 3 years old, for a brand-new, four-wheel-drive Steiger Panther II. It was an articulated behemoth, a monster that could pull a 12-bottom plow and a 40-foot field cultivator. Its price tag was astronomical, but the bank manager, Mr. Abernathy, approved the loan with a smile and a handshake. The next year, Dale built a new machine shed, a massive steel structure that dwarfed Silas's old wooden barn. He followed that up with 2 towering grain bins, complete with a modern leg elevator and drying system. He was no longer just a farmer, he was the CEO of Jensen Farms, Inc. His old equipment was replaced with a new fleet of International Harvester Red, a massive 1466 tractor, a new 800 series cycloplanter, and the crown jewel, a 1460 axial flow combine. The new combine was a marvel of technology. It didn't have straw walkers like the old machines. It used a rotor to thresh the grain, allowing it to move through the field at incredible speeds. Dale could harvest more in one day than Silas, with his old John Deere 55, could harvest in a week. The community watched in awe. Dale was seen as a visionary, a man who understood modern agriculture. He was featured in the local paper, standing in front of his new combine, talking about feeding the world. He was elected to the co-op board. When he spoke, people listened. And often he spoke about Silas Blackwood. "It's a shame," Dale would say, shaking his head over coffee at the diner. "Good man, Silas, hard worker. But he's stuck in the past, thinks his dad's way of doing things is still going to work. He's sitting on 240 acres of paid-for land, and what's he doing with it? Nothing. That land's an asset. He should be using that equity to expand, to modernize. He's letting the biggest boom in agricultural history pass him by." The other farmers would nod in agreement. They saw Silas driving his old truck, working his fields with his old equipment. They saw him patching fences and painting his own barn while they were hiring contractors to put up new buildings. They mistook his prudence for poverty, his independence for fear. He was an anomaly, a ghost from a past they were all trying to outrun. Silas, for his part, was having good years too. The high grain prices meant that his modest yields were bringing in more money than he had ever seen. But his reaction was different. He didn't see the boom as a new permanent reality. He saw it as a temporary gift, a chance to solidify his position, not to risk it. He took the extra income and, after paying his taxes and living expenses, he did something almost unthinkable in that era of rampant inflation. He saved it. Hard cash. He opened a simple passbook savings account at the same bank that was bankrolling Dale's empire. One afternoon in 1977, the bank manager, Mr. Abernathy, called him into his office. Abernathy was a portly man who wore suits that were always a little too tight. He had a picture on his desk of himself shaking hands with Earl Butz, the Secretary of Agriculture. "Silas, come in, Abernathy said, gesturing to a plush chair. "I was just looking over your accounts. You've built up quite a nest egg here." "Very impressive." "It's been a few good years," Silas said simply. "Indeed it has," Abernathy beamed, "which is why I wanted to talk to you. Silas, that money is just sitting there. With inflation running at 7%, it's actually losing value every day. We need to put that capital to work for you." He slid a plat map across his polished mahogany desk. "The Henderson place, just north of you, is coming up for sale. 80 acres. With your financial position, we could have you approved for a loan this afternoon. Land values have doubled in the last 5 years, and they're not going to stop. It's the one thing they're not making any more of." Silas looked at the map. He knew the land. It was good land. But he also knew what came with it. A mortgage, payments, a yoke. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Abernathy," Silas said, pushing the map back gently. "But I'm happy with what I've got." Abernathy's smile tightened. "Silas, you're a smart man, but you're thinking like your father. Things are different now. We're in a global market. The old rules don't apply. You have to be aggressive. You have to grow." "The old rules always apply eventually," Silas said quietly. He stood up. "Thank you for your time." He left the bank feeling more certain than ever. He saw the frantic pace of expansion, the gleam of new paint on machinery that wasn't paid for, the ever-increasing piles of debt that everyone was treating like monopoly money. It felt fragile. It felt like a house of cards built on a foundation of cheap credit and blind optimism. That evening, driving home from the feed mill, he had the radio on. The news was on, a dry voice from a Des Moines station talking about the national economy. The announcer mentioned the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. He was an inflation hawk, the announcer said, a man who believed that the only way to break the back of the country's crippling inflation was with a dose of brutal economic medicine. The term he used was monetary shock therapy, drastically higher interest rates designed to stop borrowing and cool the overheated economy. Silas gripped the worn steering wheel of his old Chevy. He looked out at his fields, the corn standing tall and green in the late July sun. The land was quiet, peaceful. It was his. All of it. He didn't know who Paul Volcker was, and he didn't understand the complexities of monetary policy, but he understood the seasons. He understood that after a long, hot, dry summer, a storm was bound to come. And he had a feeling that the whole country, and especially the farmers who had bet the farm on the good times lasting forever, were about to get caught in a downpour. The storm, when it came, wasn't one of thunder and lightning. It rolled in silently on ticker tape and radio waves. In January of 1980, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. The bottom fell out of the market overnight. Corn that had been trading at over $3 a bushel plummeted, settling into a long, grim trench around $2. It was a body blow to farmers who had leveraged their entire operations on the assumption that the good times would last forever. Then the sky turned against them. A dome of high pressure settled over the Midwest that summer, and it refused to move. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a merciless sun beat down from a hazy white sky. The corn in the fields, which should have been lush and dark green, turned a sickly shade of pale green, then yellow. The leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, a posture farmers called pineappling. The ground, once rich and black, turned the color of ash and cracked into a mosaic of hard, unforgiving plates. For Silas, it was a time for conservation. He cultivated his rows shallow and slow, trying to preserve what little moisture was left in the soil. He worried, but it was the elemental worry of a farmer facing a bad year, not the existential dread of a man facing ruin. His costs were low. He had no interest payments to make. A bad year would hurt, but it wouldn't break him. For Dale Jensen, the drought and the price collapse were a two-pronged assault on an empire built of paper. His massive tractors burned fuel at a prodigious rate, and diesel prices were soaring. His operating loans from the bank were calculated on $3 corn, not $2 corn. For the first time, the confident swagger was gone, replaced by a permanent, worried crease between his eyebrows. The coffee shop talk was no longer about expansion and horsepower. It was about survival. The true test came that fall during a harvest that was more of a salvage operation. The yields were abysmal. The corn was light and chaffy, the ears small and poorly filled. It was a race to get what little crop there was out of the field before it fell apart. Dale's massive International 1460 combine was his one remaining advantage. It could cover ground at a breathtaking pace. He ran it hard from the moment the dew burned off in the morning until deep into the night, its halogen lights cutting swaths through the dusty darkness. One moonless October evening, Silas was in his own field, chugging along in the open cab of his old John Deere 55. It was slow going. The pull-type combine rattled and groaned, but it did its job, shelling the meager ears with a steady, metronomic rhythm. Across the section, he could see Dale's lights moving, then suddenly they stopped. They sat stationary in the middle of a pass for 10 minutes, then 20. Silas finished his own row, unhooked the combine, and drove his 4020 over to the road to see if his neighbor needed help. He found Dale standing beside the silent red giant, his hands on his hips, staring at the machine as if it had personally betrayed him. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burnt hydraulic fluid. "What's the trouble?" Silas asked, throttling the John Deere down to an idle. "Don't know," Dale spat, his voice tight with frustration. "She just quit. Lost all hydrostatic drive, engines running fine, but she won't move an inch forward or back. Rotor's dead too." Silas, who knew the inner workings of his own simple machines intimately, could only offer a sympathetic shrug. Dale's combine was a labyrinth of complex hydraulics and electronics, a world away from the simple chains and belts on his own. The next morning, the implement dealer's service truck was in Dale's field. A young mechanic in clean coveralls spent hours with gauges and diagnostic tools hooked up to the combine. The final verdict was catastrophic. The main hydrostatic pump had failed, sending a cascade of metal shavings throughout the entire hydraulic system. It was contaminated from the wheel motors to the steering valves. "It's a complete teardown and flush," the mechanic told Dale grimly. "Gonna have to replace the pump, both drive motors, and probably every hose on the machine. You're looking at 10 days in the shop minimum. And the bill..." The mechanic let the word hang in the air. "It's gonna be north of $15,000. Dale just stared, his face pale. $15,000 he didn't have for a 10-day delay he couldn't afford. The bank was already breathing down his neck. For the next week and a half, the million-dollar farming operation of Jensen Farms, Inc. was paralyzed. The most advanced combine in the county sat crippled in the dealership's shop, while Silas Blackwood, with his 30-year-old machine that had been paid for twice over, methodically finished his own harvest. Then he started on his neighbor's fields to the south, a widow who rented him the ground. He worked from dawn to dusk, a solitary figure in a dusty field, the slow, steady progress of his old green machine a quiet testament to a different kind of wisdom. Every time he made a round, he could see Dale's fields, the brittle stalks standing unharvested under the autumn sky, a silent, decaying monument to the fragility of progress. The winter of 1981 was when the real storm hit. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their relentless war against inflation, pushed the prime interest rate to an unimaginable 21.5%. For the farmers who had been encouraged to borrow and expand, it was a death sentence. The variable rate loans they had signed with smiling bankers just a few years earlier were now ticking time bombs. An operating loan for $100,000 that had cost $8,000 a year in interest now cost over $20,000. At the same time, the income to pay it had been cut in half. It started with whispers, then with rumors, then with the stark reality of green and white signs hammered into the ground at the end of farm lanes. "Public auction," they read. The black letters a funereal pronouncement. First, it was the young guys, the ones who had jumped in head first at the height of the boom. Then it was established, multi-generational farms, families who had worked the same land for 100 years, their names now listed in the fine print of the auction bills. Mr. Abernathy, the bank manager who had once preached the gospel of leverage and expansion, was now a grim reaper in a tight suit. His office, once a place of optimistic projections, became a room of cold, hard ultimatums. "The board has reviewed your financials, Dale," he'd say, refusing to make eye contact. "We simply can't extend any more credit." We're going to have to call your notes." Dale Jensen's empire crumbled with shocking speed. It had been built on the assumption of ever-rising values and ever-available credit, and when those two pillars were removed, the whole structure collapsed. The first to go was the big equipment. One morning, two men from the dealership showed up with a lowboy trailer and quietly loaded the Steiger Panther II. They didn't even knock on the door. A week later, the International 1460 Combine, finally repaired, was driven straight from the dealer's lot to a holding facility to be sold. Dale was a ghost. The booming voice that had dominated the diner was gone. He was seen shuffling in and out of the bank, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of exhausted despair. The man who had lectured Silas on the necessity of spending money to make money now couldn't afford to put fuel in his pickup. Silas watched it all with a heavy heart. There was no sense of vindication, only a profound sadness for his community, which was being torn apart. He kept to himself, paid his bills on time, and used the cash he had saved during the good years to buy his seed and fertilizer for the coming spring. His passbook savings account, which Abernathy had dismissed as a waste, was now his fortress. While his neighbors were being forced to sell off land and cows to pay the bank's exorbitant interest rates, Silas owed nothing. His simple, debt-free existence, once seen as a sign of weakness, had become the ultimate source of strength. The final act came on a cold, windswept Saturday in March. The auction was held at Dale's farm. It was the biggest one the county had seen yet. Cars and trucks were parked for a half-mile in either direction along the gravel road. The entire community was there, not out of morbid curiosity, but as if attending a wake. They stood in somber groups, their hands shoved in their pockets, their breath fogging in the frigid air. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, stood on a flatbed trailer, his rhythmic chant echoing off the new steel machine shed that Dale had been so proud of. One by one, the pieces of a life's ambition were sold to the highest bidder. The 12-row cycloplanter, the 40-foot field cultivator, the grain trucks, the tools from the workshop. Each fall of the gavel was like a nail being driven into a coffin. Dale and his wife stood near the back porch of their house, watching in silence. Dale's face was a stony, expressionless mask, but his wife wept openly, her arm linked through his. Silas stood at the edge of the crowd, a silent observer. He hadn't come to buy anything, he was just there to bear witness. Finally, the auctioneer moved on to the main event. "All right, folks, now we've got what you all came for. The real estate. We're going to sell it in 3 parcels. Parcel number 1 is the home quarter. 160 acres, more or less, with the house, the barn, and the grain setup. A beautiful piece of ground, folks, a farmstead you can be proud of." The bidding started slow. These were desperate times, and there wasn't much cash in the county. The price crept up, driven mostly by an out-of-state insurance company that was buying up distressed farms. Dale flinched with every new bid, each one another blow to his shattered pride. The auctioneer's chant became a desperate plea. $300 an acre. Who'll give me $350? $300 is the bid. It's going to the insurance man for $300 an acre, folks. Are you going to let this prime Iowa land go to some corporation in Hartford, Connecticut? The crowd was silent. No one could afford it. The insurance agent, a man in a trench coat, simply nodded, confident in his victory. "Sold then, for $325. A voice called out, low and steady. A ripple went through the crowd as they turned to see who had spoken. It was Silas Blackwood. He stood near the back, his hands in the pockets of his worn overalls, his expression calm and unreadable. The insurance agent looked irritated. He conferred with a colleague, then reluctantly raised his paddle. $350. $375, Silas said immediately, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. He hadn't even blinked. A buzz went through the crowd. Silas Blackwood? The man who pinched every penny. Where was he getting this kind of money? Mr. Abernathy, the banker, who was there representing the bank's interest, looked utterly stunned. The agent from Hartford hesitated. His calculations were based on profit margins and asset liquidation, not on history or sentiment. He shook his head. He was out. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. $375 an acre is the bid. Do I hear $400? $375 once, $375 twice. Sold. To Silas Blackwood for $375 an acre. The gavel cracked like a rifle shot. A stunned silence fell over the farmyard. Silas had just bought his biggest rival's home. He walked over to the clerk's table, pulled out a simple bank checkbook, and wrote a check for the 10% down payment. It was more money than he had ever spent at one time in his life, but the check didn't bounce. After the crowd had dispersed and the last of the trucks had rumbled away down the gravel road, Silas walked over to where Dale was still standing by the house, looking like a man who had lost his moorings. Dale wouldn't look at him. "Come to gloat, Silas," he mumbled, his voice thick with shame. "Come to enjoy the show? You got what you wanted. You get to be the one who was right all along." Silas stood there for a long moment, the cold wind whipping around the corner of the house. "No, Dale," he said quietly, "that's not why I'm here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They were for his old Chevy pickup. "Your truck's been repossessed. You'll need a way to move your family's things out of the house." Dale stared at the keys as if they were a hot coal. "And one more thing," Silas continued, "this is your family's ground. Your grandfather built that barn. It shouldn't be owned by a corporation 1,000 miles away. And it shouldn't be farmed by one either." Dale finally looked up, his eyes filled with a confused, desperate hope. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need a tenant," Silas said. "The house is yours to live in, rent-free, for as long as you need to get back on your feet. You'll farm this quarter section for me. We'll do a standard crop share lease. You provide the labor, I'll provide the land and the seed for the first year. We'll use my equipment. It's not as fast as what you're used to, but it's paid for, and it runs." Dale was speechless. He looked from Silas's calm, steady eyes to the keys in his hand, and his own eyes filled with tears. The pride that had defined him for so long finally broke, washed away by a wave of disbelief and gratitude. "Why?" he whispered. "After everything I said, everything I did, why would you do this for me?" Silas looked out over the fields, the brown, sleeping earth that connected them both, that had witnessed their rivalry and now their reconciliation. "Because we're neighbors," he said. "And that's supposed to mean something." The years that followed were lean, but they were years of healing for both the men and the community. The farm crisis left deep scars, but it also taught a hard lesson. The coffee shop talk changed for good. The talk was no longer of horsepower and expansion, but of equity and cost of production. Silas Blackwood, the man they had once dismissed as a relic, was now regarded with a quiet, profound respect. He never said, "I told you so." He never had to. His survival was statement enough. Dale Jensen, humbled and changed, became a good farmer and a better man. He worked Silas's land with a diligence and care he'd never shown when he was managing his own debt-fueled empire. He learned to fix the old 40-20, to listen to its rhythms, to appreciate its simple, rugged honesty. 5 years later, with a small loan from a chastened and reorganized bank, he bought back the home quarter from Silas, paying him exactly what Silas had paid for it, plus a modest amount of interest. The handshake that sealed that deal was one between equals. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 20 years after that fateful auction, Silas was in the machine shed with his grandson, a boy of 16 with his grandfather's quiet eyes. They were working on the old Farmall M, giving it a tune-up. The tractor, long retired from field work, was now used for mowing and parades, a cherished family heirloom. "Grandpa," the boy asked, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag, "why did you keep this old thing all these years? You could have bought a new one 10 times over." Silas ran a hand over the faded red paint of the Farmall's hood. He looked at his grandson, a young man on the cusp of his own life, and he saw the future. "This tractor taught me a lesson," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "It taught me that you don't measure a man by the shine on his paint or the size of his engine. You measure him by what he owns, and I don't just mean land and equipment. I mean what he owns free and clear inside himself. His word, his skills, his independence." He pointed to the big John Deere 40-20 parked in the next bay, its engine cool, but its presence still powerful. "That tractor over there, and this one here, they don't have a radio, they don't have air conditioning. But your great-grandfather paid for this one with cash, and I did the same with that one. They never sent us a bill. They never owned a piece of us. They were our partners, not our masters." He looked out the wide door of the shed, across the fields bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The land was his. The machines were his. The peace in his heart was his. It was a fortune that couldn't be measured in dollars or bushels. It was the quiet, unshakable wealth of a life built not on the shifting sands of credit, but on the solid rock of hard work, patience, and the simple, timeless wisdom of knowing what was truly his.